One sometimes gathers that the psychologists have come close to wishing that the IQ test had never been discovered. Not long ago, it was thought of as the finest bloom of the psychological discipline. Now the profession is torn in controversy over it, its meaning, its constitution, its social implications. Professor Richard Herrnstein of Harvard is an arch villain in the eyes of many for his studies of IQ and findings that are inconsistent with egalitarian maxims and democratist ideals. I have, by the way, no way of knowing personally whether Mr. Herrnstein's findings are correct, and as a believer in metaphysical equality, I'm perhaps less concerned if they should prove to be correct than others might be, but that is by the way. Dr. Herrnstein's recent book, IQ in the Meritocracy, argues that intelligence is primarily inherited, and that being the case, all efforts to equalize environmental experience will necessarily result in accentuating the results of genetic differences. Professor Thomas Bever of Columbia is a brilliant young professor of experimental psychology who trained at Harvard and is a devoted critic of the doctrine of inherited intelligence. I should like to begin by asking a fundamental, but I hope not entirely naive question of Dr. Herrnstein. Is the usefulness of IQ now effectively challenged, or do objections tend to be ideological in nature?
The objections tend to be ideological, but I think the usefulness has been hurt by the politicization of the subject, and I wouldn't venture to predict what the fate of the IQ test is in the United States. I think it's somewhat uncertain at this point.
Well, is the scrutiny that is now given to the IQ test, which let us assume was ideologically motivated, has it in fact isolated certain scientific shortcomings and caused a reappraisal scientifically of something which was simply accepted as axiomatically useful?
Not that I've been able to trace down. I've looked for such a thing. 10 years ago, the things that I've said in my book and in my magazine article earlier than that were being said in introductory textbooks. They're considered a commonplace for students of psychology. Now they're very controversial, and in between then and now, there's been no data that I know of that would have challenged these findings.
Any data that you know of, Mr. Bauer?
No, I think that a frequent way to view the IQ test now is as a reflection of the structure of social goals, socially desired goals or undesired goals, but goals, for better or worse, that we all live with. The IQ test as a measure of social success, or intended to be a predictor in certain cases of certain kinds of social success, necessarily reflects social issues, and therefore is less likely than many other kinds of measures or experimental studies that we do to reveal anything psychologically interesting.
What more was one prepared to get out of IQ tests than merely that, Mr. Herrnstein?
I think there have been people along the way who felt that the IQ test was a realization, fulfillment of a theory of intelligence or a theory of cognitive power. I myself have never felt that way. As a psychological device at the level that Bever is talking about it, I would agree that it's not very interesting. I don't think it expresses a theory of the mind of any particular substance. On the other hand, as an instrument of prediction, it's very potent. There is no other measure of a 7 or 8-year-old child that has comparable predictive validity, even the family background or the education of the parents or what have you. And that's just a factual matter. And so let me say that I think the IQ test is interesting sociologically, even if not very interesting psychologically.
Or rather, what is your defense against your critics who say that you have taken the IQ test and run with it in forbidden directions?
Well, my defense is simply I haven't seen the alternative case. The argument exists at 2 levels, at least, probably more. There's first the factual level, and at that level, what I say is, I think, quite orthodox. IQ tests are predictive of various kinds of success. They're predictive of success in school in the first place, and then they're also
So far, no quarrel there, right? Yeah, okay.
The correlations, we could argue about the magnitude of the correlations, but I'm willing to give up quite a lot here in order to get agreement at the factual level. And then second, the IQ measures a heritable trait. There's no argument about that either. The argument exists, as far as I know, at the level of what is the magnitude of this heritability of IQ. And even there, I might surprise you with my amiability. I'm willing to give up quite a few points there in order to spare us an argument.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think that in the absence, as you've indicated earlier, of a theory of intelligence, you've said that the IQ test is a functional predictor that we can sometimes make use of if we don't abuse it. And I agree with that. But in the absence of a theory of what intelligence is, I think that it's very unclear what one means to say that the IQ test measures something that is in fact heritable.
It's not unclear at all. When you give a group of children, or adults for that matter, IQ tests, you get a group of numbers. The numbers don't know where they came from, and these numbers can be subjected to a statistical procedure known as the estimate of heritability, and that has been done, for upwards of 40,000 cases that I know of in the technical literature for IQ. And the answer comes out that the variation in IQ scores from individual to individual is something between 60 and 90% heritable. Now, you don't need a theory of intelligence to say that. As I say, the numbers just behave like numbers. They don't care what your theory about them
It's a purely psychometric
Precisely.
result.
In fact, the statistical procedure is tantamount to, equivalent to something called analysis of variance, which is one of the standard statistical procedures of experimental psychologists. So that using a very common statistical procedure, one comes up with an answer that I think has considerable sociological importance, even if not very much psychologically.
So that there are questions as to whether aside from whether the theory is appropriate or not, there are a number of questions about the data. Dr. Herrnstein cites estimates ranging from 60 to 90% of the variance accounted for by heredity, variance in IQ test performance, which, as we all have started out agreeing, says nothing about intelligence.
I don't think we agreed on that, but go ahead.
It is not about intelligence, let's put it that way. I think that those estimates have been questioned. There are people who claim that the true number is much lower. But I don't think I don't think that those sorts of questions are ultimately the determinative ones. I think in trying to assess the structure of the argument, I think in terms of trying to understand where society is going as a function of the equalization of education, the alleged equalization of education, that we simply have to treat those arguments on their own merits, if they have any.
Yeah. To all of which you reply what?
Well, Bever, whom I've known for a long time, and so I speak with no newly acquired animus because of your remarks, starts off by...
It's an old animus?
It's an old animus. Starts off, no, not at all. Starts off by casting doubt on my credentials as an expert in statistics, and it would embarrass me to try to defend these credentials. But let's instead turn to the consensus of the field itself. In 1967, Leona Tyler, who everyone would agree is an expert in mental testing, the author of the definitive textbook for undergraduates the world over, published the third edition of her book, The Psychology of Individual Differences, in which she said that the estimates of heritability range, the estimates of the genetic contribution to IQ, I don't remember if she used the word heritability, range upwards of 50%. But maybe Tom's not talking about psychological experts. Perhaps he's talking about genetic experts. Well, the brand new mammoth book in human genetics is by parageneticists named Cavalli, Sforza, and Bodmer. And in their book, they say that estimates of the heritability of IQ range between 40% and 80%. But that 40%, as they quickly point out, is a narrow definition of heritability rather than a broad definition, and that for broad definitions, which is what I've been talking about all along, the estimates do range around 80%. Dobzhansky, another expert, famous geneticist, in his recent little book said something of the order of 50 studies of IQ. The world over leave no substantial doubt that IQ is heritable. I don't remember if he gave a figure, but he said substantially so. And so I think what Tom is doing when he says that the facts are in doubt is engaging in a kind of obscurantism that academics have chosen to face the facts in this subject. And I think they've chosen it because the facts are, in fact, politically unwelcome rather than empirically so. Or to put it another way, if the facts about IQ's heritability are really in doubt, as Tom says they are, then I know of no psychological finding that is not in vastly more doubt.
I didn't say that the facts, I didn't say it's in doubt that there is evidence that something about IQ score is inherited, that some component that goes into a particular IQ score is inherited. What I was simply referring to in that regard is that there are people who claim that the particular estimates given by any other particular party are wrong. That's all I mean. I think that if you mean by broad heritability the kind of heritability in which the environment can intervene as a critical part of it, then I think there's no difficulty at all.
By broad heritability, it's a very technical concept. I simply mean the total genetic impact rather than the narrow heritability, which is just that genetic impact that expresses itself in an additive way. And when you do heritability analyses, you must decide beforehand whether you want the broad figure or the narrow figure, and that dictates the treatment of the statistics. Incidentally, let me say, in a word of agreement, almost any study is subject to certain kinds of criticism, and in that respect, the literature contains lots of controversy. But if you look at the literature, you see that the answers do range in this rather broad range, and I pick a broad range deliberately so as not to step on any particular set of toes, between 60% and about 90%, and that the answers have converged in that vicinity since about 1908 on, which is when these studies were first beginning to be collected in Great Britain. And as the statistical procedures have improved and the database has enlarged, the estimates have narrowed down more closely in the vicinity of 70 to 80%.
Okay, well now let's leave that for a moment and go on and ask this question: do you find any necessary social deductions that follow from the findings you're talking about, as opposed to simply suggestive ones?
Well, that's of course the very interesting issue. I stated my case in the form of a syllogism, and I think is the answer to your question.
Could you recite that?
Well, the syllogism-like argument, I should call it, is that if mental capacities are inherited to some degree, and if those capacities are required for success in society to some degree.
If high mental capacities are.
Yes, if those capacities play a role, in a necessary role in social standing, then it follows that social standing will to some extent express genetic differences between people. And as I view it, if the two premises are accepted, then the conclusion follows. The two premises are empirical and subject to empirical test. And I think there is a component of speculation in there that I'd be happy to make explicit. But yes, I do think that as long as a society values the kinds of traits that IQ tests touch on, however crudely, then it will indeed turn out that society will stratify itself according to genetic differences to some extent.
Mr. Bevel,
well,
do you agree that the conclusion follows from the premises?
Technically, no. But I think that Dr. Herrnstein was careful at one point to call it a syllogistic-like argument, and I would agree with him there that it's an argument that sounds like it's a syllogism. I would say that if one wants to, if you want to consider the argument as made, it can be interpreted in two ways. either it's a rather uninteresting statement, namely
Because it's a truism?
yes, that in a society which ranks people according to what they're born with, that then people will be ranked according to what they're born with. In which case, Dr. Herrnstein has become an armchair tautologist. But the more interesting claim, in which presumably have no interest, but the more interesting claim is the possibility that there's something malicious here, that there's something that we are not in control of, that there are forces that will structure the society for us in ways that we don't wish if we practice the continued attempts to make educational opportunities more available, more widely available. That, I think, is potentially a more interesting interpretation, but has no facts to support it.
Well, now, I don't understand that Mr. Herrnstein is, in fact, arguing this. As I understand you, you're simply observing that as you narrow differences here, you accentuate them there, which is not tautologous at all, is it? I.e., if all environmental differences are in fact abolished, then the only residual differences you will perforce ascribe to genetic factors, right?
Yes.
Now, this is a purely scientific observation, isn't it? I don't see how one can argue with it.
That is a tautology. I don't call it an observation.
Well, you can have tautologous observations. You know.
Those are the ones that were true already, you mean?
Well, an awful lot that's true already wasn't perceived. You know, Thales began perceiving things that were always true.
Well, actually, I don't mind being held guilty of a tautology if indeed my argument is tautologous. That might be because it is a syllogism. And syllogisms are, in fact, tautologous, are they not? And I think the importance of the syllogism is that it's something we hadn't noticed. We hadn't noticed that a society that succeeds in equalizing all of the social opportunities for success will, perforce, if it values individual differences, end up distinguishing people on reasons other than the social, namely the genetic. That's the tautology, and it's an alarming tautology. There can be such a thing.
Why is that alarming?
Well, because that's not what people expect to happen as a result of equalization of opportunity, I don't think.
You don't think that...
If they do, then why are they so upset?
You don't think that people expect that it would be a better world than the one we live in at the moment if every person was able to express his or her talents to the fullest extent?
Well, I mean, I personally think that's much fairer than a world in which people are not permitted to express their talents. On the other hand, if these talents are somewhat genetic and run in families, then this world, this better world we're talking about, will have social classes. The classes will tend to run in families, and there you are. You'll still have the class struggle. I do feel that society does tend to converge on a collection of human traits that it values. And although our society is pluralistic, and although we may strive for even greater pluralism, there are social limitations on this, that certain kinds of human traits are valuable to virtually any conceivable human society.
On the one hand, Dr. Herrnstein proposes the following, that there's a dangerous millennium around the corner if equalization of education really gets out of hand. If we remove
because it causes
environmental
despair.
difference.
Because it will cause despair, I take it. Is that why it's dangerous?
No, because I don't know if you mean that as well, but because it will, he claims, lead to a society, I think to paraphrase a quote of his, in which poverty will be inherited like bad teeth, and that people will simply be genetically structured
well, now look, you're
this,
jumbling up
class
things
that they
here,
have.
and I'd like to break in just so as you don't give a false impression of what I've said. I've never said that I object to the equalization of education.
No, you said you paint the dangerous millennium is how I referred to it.
Yes, well, that's your phrase, not
Yes.
mine.
Yes.
And as far as I'm concerned, I think we're driven toward equalization of education on other grounds, and we have to face this prospect. What I'm saying is that when education is equalized, then socially equalized, then the differences shown by children and people in schools will be due to their genetic differences.
Right, but whether those are socially relevant differences
Well, now
will be a
let's talk
question of the
about that.
structure of the society.
Let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, let me just make one point before we go on to that, namely that the presumption seems to be that the equalization of environmental opportunity is around the corner in the hands of educational psychologists. I don't mean to say that you necessarily believe or have claimed that, but it certainly is not true. So that what we must be talking about, if we're talking about
What's
anything,
not true?
that the understanding of how to educate children and how to structure their environment.
I don't pretend to know
has
what's
reached-
around the corner.
has
I mean,
reached
I don't
such-
know if we're there or not.
Fine,
or if we're
okay.
about to be
In that
there.
case, I think that one has to also admit that some uncertainty as how the social values might change around the corner. So one can't predict that it will be the case that money or other forms of exchange will be the way in which society structures its different levels.
I think
and,
it's time to introduce
disperses its
some facts
reinforcements.
into the argument again. I think the argument does, as I say, fluctuate between these
Yeah.
two levels of,
Yeah.
of fact and political philosophy. The question that Tom is raising is an interesting one. Does society have to value those things that show up in IQ tests, however crudely? Can't there be a society that values other things perhaps that are not inherited?
But we have a society that values other things. We don't have a society whose attachments are absolutely hierarchical based on IQ achievement.
That's right.
So we have it already. We have a society that values people for different reasons. A comedian is highly valued in the society, but he's not necessarily somebody who has very high IQ.
Well, but you're looking at the conspicuous exceptions.
Well, sure. That's the easiest way to do it.
But if you looked at the population at large, the IQ is correlated with social standing of the order of 0.5 or 0.7, depending on whose study you look at. I mean, those are the correlations that I'm talking about. And this does, as Tom says, express a value, that is an unconscious value in our society. My argument, look at it this way. My argument could be taken as applying only to the society in which we live, or only to the societies that exist in the world right now, because whenever these studies are done elsewhere, the data come out about the same, and it makes no difference whether the political system is socialist, so-called, or capitalist, or some mixed society. That is to say, these data turn up in the Soviet Union and in Sweden and in the United States without very much difference. And that's really all I have any basis for, empirically speaking. Now, I do venture beyond that, and I offer speculation. I think that it's no accident that society values these traits. I think there are very real reasons. The work that needs to be done in a society calls on the abilities that are measured to some extent by IQ tests.
Well, that's obvious again, isn't it? You can't have somebody who's intellectually completely inept running a computer, for instance, right?
And people will insist, for example, that their airplane pilots meet some standard of performance and conduct and so on,
Yeah.
because airplane pilots play a very consequential
Yeah.
role in our lives.
Yeah.
But
I
that's
think
the
that's a characteristic, I think, of a complex society. Now, what your argument, if you're arguing with
Because
me about
I
this,
suppose he can argue at a radical level, this is a society that enjoys transportation. And if you repeal the right to move, then
That's
you
right.
repeal the
well, that's precisely what I was headed toward.
Yeah.
I didn't argue that.
Well, I think what you have to face is that if you argue that a society need not value these things, then you should go further and say, well, what kind of society might it be in which these things that are correlated with IQ tests are no longer valued?
Once we have that test, we can't then turn around and say that this test, which is simply an indicator of, insofar as it works at all, of where a child stands vis-a-vis how he will do in the society, of something internal, something independently discovered about the society itself. It's a reflection of the society, and it's intended to be so.
Well, no, there are two facts about it that are more or less independent. The first fact is the predictiveness of the IQ score for our society.
That's the extent to which it succeeds in its
That's
goal.
right, and the testers in the early days and even now were very frank about trying to maximize the predictive validity of their tests. And the correlations between IQ and school performance showed the extent to which the testers were successful. That's fact number one. Fact number two is that the numbers you get when you give a group of children an IQ test define a heritable trait. That has nothing to do with the first. It might not have. For all anyone knew when they were developing IQ tests, trying to make them predictive for school work, they might very well have come up with a test that had extremely low heritabilities. There was nothing in the, no constraint operating on the tester that forced him to make the test measure a heritable trait. That's just how it worked out. Because it worked out that way, certain conclusions then follow. But they are independent. Tom is talking about here, and a very legitimate one, and that's the question of how would the IQ score behave if the world were vastly different?
Yeah.
If the cookie jars were much deeper, for example, then the length of the arm might not make so much difference anymore. Well, in fact, it's possible that in a different sort of world, the IQ would not be so variable from person to person. It's possible that the IQ would not be very predictive. And I freely admit that in a world that I can't quite imagine, none of my arguments would have any relevance. There are some small quantities of data that bear specifically on this question. And the studies are a little bit like this. Take a group of children in an average sort of school environment and look at the variation in their IQ scores. Now take another group of children and look at them in a very much better school environment. The average score will rise. That is, school does have some effect. However, the variation from child to child does not get any smaller. In fact, it gets a little larger. So that the interaction that you're talking about, as far as the evidence shows, does not go in the direction of making the IQ less variable. If we make the school system that much better, we will still face individual to individual differences.
It'd be like a mobile.
Exactly. We'll just lift the thing up. Certainly they won't get any more compressed in IQ, but it is even possible from the looks of the data that as we make the environment better, the people who take greatest advantage of this improvement are the people at the upper end of the IQ scale right now, and so that their scores will move up even more.
So there's a polarization.
So that there's a further polarization. Now, that's not to say that someone won't invent an environment that will have just the opposite effect, but no one has yet, and I haven't even seen a plausible proposal.
Suppose 10 years from now there simply is no argument on the heritability of intelligence, IQ. And let's say that we have arrived at the figure of 80%, leaving only 10% that can be manipulated through education and environment. Does it then follow that genetic manipulation is the next and most attractive field of inquiry for educational meliorists, psychologists, or do you think that there's a presumptive argument against it, that it's something that one simply shouldn't talk about on the grounds that you disturb the chemistry of nature?
I think there's a presumptive argument against it. On the other hand, I wouldn't say one shouldn't talk about it. I think it's good to talk about these things and maybe even do research on animals and get our understanding of these genetic processes more firmly in hand. The presumptive argument against it is that I simply don't trust the people who run today's states with the power over the genetic future of the species. And the reason for that is that biologists teach us that what is adaptively suitable in this world may in fact not be adaptively suitable in some world that we can't anticipate. That the human species, like any other biological species, has in it an enormous reservoir of variation, genetic variation. And that although that reservoir of genetic variation creates certain social problems right now, I believe it does, for the future of mankind, I think this genetic variation is one of our most precious legacies. And I would very strenuously resist. Now, this is a political matter.
Well, certainly a state-operated one, you obviously would, but what about a permissive one? Sperm banks and public auctions of Einstein's?
Perhaps, but I'd go very slow on this because I think there is a danger that we reshape the genetic legacy of the species in terms of criteria that will pass.
Dr. Bever, why is it that the very techniques that we have used to assess the heritability of such traits as height and hair color and body size, which all have agreed are appropriate techniques to assess the genetic component in those traits, you now regard as inadequate to assess the heritability of intelligence. The techniques being studying the correlations between pairs of people as the blood relationship between those pairs increases from identical twins down to unrelated pairs of persons. If you in fact look at the correlations in terms of IQ, you will find them to be, one, very close to the theoretical probabilities that you would derive if you had generated a genetic model, and two, you will find that they increase with the blood relation. Now, why is that technique which we use to assess height and the genetic component to height now inapplicable to the situation of intelligence?
And it is alleged by people who are better trained than I in mathematics that this creates certain problems for applying
You've been misled by those people.
That may be.
Because
That may be, but
when you do the estimate of heritability of something like height, the statistical procedure converts it into a relative measure.
Right.
Because the estimates of heritability are always based on a scale that has the same statistical properties as the IQ. Let me just, I know you weren't asking me, but let me break in here, that in the last few years, experts are beginning to argue that schizophrenia is substantially heritable. And an entity like schizophrenia barely has even the most rudimentary forms of measurement
No less
connected
definition.
to it, and yet it's still possible by careful use of statistical procedures to make rough estimates of the heritability of something like schizophrenia.
Oh, yes, I'd like to ask Dr. Bever, you sort of slipped by the twin studies, which Dr. Herrnstein talked about quite a bit in his article, the Jensen ones, and he concluded the environment is not very important from those. Now, I know there have been studies recently that have sort of refuted the data of the twin studies. Would you have some comments on why you think they're refuted?
The time is short, and it's a complicated issue. Basically, the twin studies have been gone over by some respected psychologists, a respected psychologist in particular, and Dr. Kamen. And he concludes from his review of the primary data involved in the twin studies that they overstated the case, to put it mildly. He has somewhat stronger conclusions in certain cases, but I think that that's certainly one that I would concur with.
So as not to leave a false impression on the air, I don't know of any studies, any empirical studies that refute the twin data. There is an unpublished work by this chap at Princeton that is circulating around the country in the oral tradition that purports to have refuted early analyses, but I think it's characteristic of the controversy in the field that unpublished work receives such wide currency.